Welcome to Brain Pain, where we discuss everything psychology. As I do every single podcast, I need to remind you that I am not a therapist. I do encourage you to go find a therapist if you need help, and nothing that I discuss none of it can possibly replace therapy or proper pharmacology, depending on what you may be facing or someone you know. So just keep that in mind. I do have my master's in psychology, and I am currently working on a PsyD, which is a doctoral degree in psychology. I'm going to talk about coping strategies today. Now, I've mentioned them in passing and discussing the need for them, but I want to talk about actual coping strategies that are used. There's no way I can cover all of them, but I am going to talk about some specific ones that I found interesting for a number of reasons, which we'll get into. I also want to talk about the fact that I have some interesting things, interesting to me, coming up for this podcast. I actually have some people who are going to be willing to talk about certain subjects and how they've experienced them and how they see the impact that they've had on their lives. Now, these are not people that are in psychology. These are simply people who have dealt with any number of things. And it's kind of like the layman's perception, experience. And I just thought it would be interesting to get a few different people with different life experiences to talk about coping skills they've used or they wish they would have used in the past. So that'll be coming up in a future episode of Brain Pain. Now, coping strategies. I think when we start talking about coping strategies, we have to realize that coping strategies need context. That is, there is not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to coping strategies. The situation, the emotion that you're dealing with, the challenges you may be dealing with may require a variety of coping mechanisms, and you may require a combination of coping mechanisms to deal with certain things. So let's put all the context about the context in context. Oh, I do amuse myself. Anyway, there are positive and there are negative coping strategies, but when I say negative, it means having a negative outcome versus one that has a positive outcome. What is considered generally even a negative coping strategy may have application that is better than the alternatives. Again, context. But let's list some of these that we can consider. I'm looking at my list to make sure I don't forget them. So there's anger-related emotion regulation, which is similar to emotion regulation or palliative emotion regulation. They all deal with, guess what? Emotion regulation. There's social support seeking. There's problem solving. There's avoidant coping, and media use. And these are all the ones that I'm going to kind of touch on today. There are many more. Any strategy to cope with stress and extreme emotion. Well, let's talk about that. What are we coping with? Typically, when we talk about coping skills, we're discussing some form of stress or anxiety, something that's not going the way we'd like it to go, and we need to be able to cope with it. That does not mean resolve it successfully, and that's important to know the difference. Coping means dealing with things as they are, not necessarily resolving them. Now, when we get to problem solving, that may result in a resolution to whatever it is that's causing you stress. However, it may not. Problem solving may simply result in you finding out that you cannot get the results you were looking for. Perhaps you get results that are acceptable. Perhaps you get results that are still terrible, and you need to use a different coping strategy. But it's important to know that this isn't a way to solve all the problems. This is a way to cope when things aren't solved or aren't resolved the way you might wish they were. Now, emotion regulation, I've read a lot about it, and man, to me, it seems a bit nebulous. It seems like there are actually very solid steps and very clear instructions, but it doesn't seem, how do I put this? It doesn't really seem easy to grasp. It's a bit abstract. Now, the one thing that I can absolutely say when you talk about emotion regulation is the idea that you have to identify the emotion and that you are going through that emotion. Now, this is very similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, and it could be considered an aspect of it. But the idea is to recognize the emotion, recognize the onset of the emotion, and realize you're experiencing the emotion. That sounds, when you say it out loud, it sounds, well, that's obvious. No, it's not always obvious. We are not always very aware of what emotions we are feeling. We are not always very aware of the emotions that we are reacting to. How many times have you seen someone who's grumpy? Are they feeling a negative emotion that they just aren't even aware of, and that's why they're grumpy? It could also be a defensive coping strategy, but I'm not going to go through all that today. But you have to identify the emotion. And sometimes this is difficult because, I'm angry. And I've had this conversation with a number of people. So if any of you are listening where I've had this conversation with you, it's not just you. There are a lot of other people who've had a similar conversation with me. And that is that often when we think we feel anger, or we even do feel anger, let's just say we feel anger. We feel anger because it's easier to cope with than feeling hurt. So often, and I mean so often, while you may feel anger at a friend, at a life partner, at someone who is important in your life, maybe they aren't even that important, but a lot of time that anger is laying over a deeper, more raw emotion of hurt. They've hurt me. But if we're hurt, we're a victim. And so to gain control, or to feel in control, instead of feeling as a victim, we get angry. Now that anger might also be justified for other reasons, but if we admit we're hurt, that makes us vulnerable. And to tell the other person that they hurt us makes us vulnerable, and that's not where most people want to be. Most people don't want to be vulnerable, even with people they should feel safe being vulnerable with. So recognize it. You got to put a name on it. If you can't name it, it becomes difficult to deal with. I mean, that's why we have diagnosis for anything. Right? A broken arm. Well, if you just say, hey, something in my body hurts, well, that's not specific enough to treat. We have to find out that your arm is broken so that then we can have a plan of action to repair your arm. It's the same with emotion regulation. You have to kind of find out what that real emotion is, and you may have to go through a couple layers, and it's okay if you don't really understand it and it takes you a while to get through it, because that's another aspect of emotion regulation. You need to have self-compassion And there are a lot of people who are not very good at being compassionate towards themselves. Often they're compassionate to others. They're often very willing to, accept and, like I said, have compassion for other people, but not themselves. And there's a number of reasons for this. I think that a lot of it ties back to self-worth and self-image, but regardless, you need to give yourself a break. You need to not be too hard on yourself and let yourself find your way through. Otherwise, you won't. Because if you're too hard on yourself, you won't pursue your emotion regulation. You will simply distract yourself, and we'll go into that in a bit. So once you've named the emotion, you have to accept the emotion. Right? You're going to feel it. You're going to feel that emotion, and it's okay to feel that emotion. It's okay to feel whatever you feel. However, it's not okay to behave in any manner as a response. And that's the other aspect of the emotion regulation is you need to control impulsive reactions and try and react appropriately. It's okay to feel that emotion. Allow yourself to feel the emotion. Allow yourself to understand that that emotion is exactly that. It's an emotion. It's not objective reality. And for those of you who want to get an argument over objective reality, I'm not going to do that. I've had a couple people say, "Oh, well, objective reality doesn't exist." Not going to have that. I'm not going to have that argument. I'm just going to say, objectively, if someone else is standing there and watching what's going on and hears everything that's said and understands even the backgrounds, still what you're experiencing is an emotion, which makes your reality subjective. So the idea is to dampen the emotion enough so that you can control any impulsive behavior and improve your satisfaction with your life by not making poor decisions and reacting to an emotional cue. Instead, being able to have an appropriate reaction to what's going on, or be proactive in preventing things from getting worse, etc. So that's emotional regulation. I found it just interesting because it does mirror cognitive behavioral therapy a lot. Now, I want to talk about one of the commonly called maladaptive coping mechanisms, which is avoidance. Escapism, avoidant coping. There's a couple names for it, but it basically means you avoid whatever it is that's stressing you out. And I'm going to use a very common, very easy example. If I've cooked a big meal and I go and I sit down and eat and everyone eats, and then there's a pile of dishes waiting to be done, pile of dirty dishes. And I decide instead to go play a video game or go work on the car or go take a nap or go to bed and try to avoid those dishes. Those dishes don't go away. And the reality is, I probably cause myself a lot more stress trying to not think about the fact that I have a kitchen full of dirty dishes. I probably spend a lot more time thinking about the fact that I have a kitchen full of dirty dishes and I'm trying not to do them than if I just went and did the dishes and just went and dealt with that thing that's sitting out there that needs to be done or needs to be dealt with. Now, at the beginning of this podcast, I mentioned that everything's in context. And I say that because I don't believe that avoidant coping is always bad as long as it's not an attempt at a permanent resolution. I think that sometimes we as humans need a little bit of space before we approach or deal with deal with a stress or an anxiety. Sometimes we need to take the time to avoid it until we get the help we need to deal with it. However, I believe just like the dishes, if you use that as your coping mechanism, the one coping mechanism that you're going to use, I believe that it causes a lot more harm than it does good. And there's a number of articles you can look up to understand the details of it, but that's the synopsis. If you're avoiding dealing with something, it's like anything else you've avoided. You avoid paying your taxes, it becomes more painful when you finally have to have no choice. Right? There's a number of famous people who have made a lot of money and had to deal with taxes that they put off for too long, and there's a lot of stories about where they ended up in prison or paying ridiculous fees and fines because they didn't deal with it when it should have been dealt with. So avoidance is universally accepted as typically maladaptive. The reason that it's maladaptive is because by ignoring it, it's a passive thing, and it becomes, and the stress and anxiety don't leave, and so they sit there, and your base level of anxiety or stress just climbs. It just gets bigger and bigger. It may be slow, but it still gets bigger and bigger. And so actually dealing with it, problem solving, using emotional regulation, these are all, and there's a number of others, but using another strategy is usually best. And I say that with the exception of there is, again, you can't use it forever. But I believe avoidant coping is better than self-harm. So in context, it would be better to be using an avoidant coping strategy as opposed to self-harm until you can get the help you need. And as I've said, and I say all the time, is get the help you need. But definitely avoidance is better than self-harm. The last one I want to talk about is social support. This comes under a lot of different guises. And when I say guise, I shouldn't say guises. I should say a lot of different flavors. There's a lot of different flavors of social support. But they come down to the same basic reasons that they work. One is support groups. They found that in World War II, coming back, and this was in the book on killing, coming back, basically impromptu support groups allowed a lot of veterans in World War II, combat veterans, to come back and really deal with the trauma of the experience of being in war, and such a horrific war as World War II. There are support groups out there for, just about everything that people struggle through. Cancer survivors, support groups. Right. For people who have suffered the loss of a loved one, support groups. And these are great things because it allows you to talk to other people who have experienced something similar. Maybe not the same thing, but something very similar. And this is important because there's another coping strategy that ties into this, which is a talk therapy, but allows you to talk through your experiences in a place where other people understand intimately the struggles that you're going through because they've experienced them themselves. And this doesn't necessarily come, again, to a resolution of a situation or a problem, but allows you to put it in perspective. It allows you to understand that you're not alone. And I think it's my impression that seeing someone who has faced the same challenges that you have be happy or be satisfied with life, subjective well-being being rated as high, it allows you to know that you can be happy again, that it's okay to survive. It's okay to be happy. It's okay to experience all of this, all of the emotion, and it doesn't make you any less valuable or any less important in the lives of others. 12-step programs. This is a form of social support, or seeking social support is technically the strategy name. 12-step programs. They have a lot of steps, right? They have the 12 steps that they go through, but what brings those 12 steps to work is the social support. Having others that have been through the same thing that you have, whatever your 12-step program may be, and knowing that others have done this, knowing that others have experienced things similar to you, and being able to talk about it may not resolve anything initially. Being able to talk to a group of people who have had, a rough time with alcohol or drugs or overeating or whatever 12-step program there is, you seriously can at least get the relief to know that going on this journey can be rewarding and that your life can improve. So those are all the positive social support aspects. One of the things that's common is these are with people that are either face-to-face or well-known. You're very familiar with these individuals, or they're a face-to-face in-person group. And it might even be, in modern times, a FaceTime or a video chat. Choose your flavor, choose your program, but a video chat type support group. Now, where social support is, in my mind, becoming maladaptive is in a lot of our social media. You go to a social media platform and you see someone who is looking for support or help, or they're looking at a community that is unvetted, that in many cases is guilty as a group of groupthink. And if you don't know what groupthink is, we might go into that in another episode, but go look it up. Groupthink can be very destructive. The people they're looking to for support are not validated or vetted. They could be anybody. Their typical group that they go to is guilty of groupthink, because in social media, people tend to surround themselves with people that have, or say they have, the exact same ideas and thoughts that you do, no matter whether those are good or bad, or it doesn't really matter. Then also, you're seeking support from people who are looking for validation by being part of the group, and who simply want you to validate them as a human being by saying things like, "Oh, you made me feel better," or "Oh, I'm so glad that I'm not crazy," or I'm not doing the wrong thing. Well, they may have just told you to do something that's very self-destructive in the long run because they thought that's what you want to hear. So going and seeking out people who are just going to tell you that, hey, you're perfect just the way you are, can have a negative impact. And I think with social media, using social media as a social support can have those downfalls. I mean, I tend not to use social media much. There's a few people, that's the only way I have contact with them. But while in there, I see some posts of people that they commented on or things, and I don't think social media is where you should go to air out your personal relationship drama. All right. I mean, if you're looking for help, like you seriously need help or you're going to hit a point of self-harm, whatever avenue gets you that help. But I'm talking about getting legitimate help. I'm not talking about what's going on in social media, where we can delude ourselves into believing that, yeah, we did the right thing because we went to the group that we knew would tell us we did the right thing, even if we suspect that what we did was wrong. We won't go to someone who maybe has no reason to lie to you and just give you honest feedback, because we want to be validated. We want to have the support that says, yes, what we did was good. So I think that there are those dangers, but it's like anything else. There's good and there's bad to any of these tools that we have at our disposal. There's an article that is easily accessible on the internet, and it's called A Count of Coping Strategies, a longitudinal study of investigating an alternative method to understanding coping and adjustment. What I took from this article, the big important thing that I took from this article, is that being flexible and having an appropriate coping strategy for various situations results in better subjective well-being or a more satisfying life. That means having more than one or two coping strategies, being able to find the coping strategy that fits the situation. Maybe sometimes you need the social support. Maybe sometimes you need to use emotional regulation. Or use of any other of the many coping strategies that are in existence. And I would encourage you to go look them up. But having more than one and being flexible in how you apply those coping mechanisms, those coping skills, those coping strategies, can be very beneficial. And helping others. And so, but I mean, to have a conscious strategy or skill, you'll have to look it up and develop it. Or look at the way you cope with things. Do you have more than one skill? Do you have more than one strategy? Do you have more than one way you deal with different things? Because some of these things that we use as coping strategies are things that develop naturally. The social support was a naturally developed coping strategy. Happens impromptu a lot. It doesn't take an actual named support group to be a support group. So with all that, I want to encourage you, if you do have, if you feel that you need help, I encourage you to reach out and get help. If you know someone who needs help, I encourage you to encourage them to get help. With that, I'll say, remember that I love you. Take care of yourself. And rock on.